Please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the chamber will hear the testimony of an expert to TCE 97, and the greffier Sakalbuti could report the attendance of parties and individuals to today's proceedings. Sakalbuti, Mr. President, for today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present, except Penh, the national lead co-lawyers for civil parties, is absent due to his personal business. And Vietnamese is a designated counsel for Mr. Penh. As for Nuon Chea, he is present in the holding cell downstairs, as he waives his rights to be present in the courtroom. His waiver has been delivered to the greffier, and the expert to be testified today, that is through TCE 97, confirms through her best ability she has no relationship by blood or by law to any of the two accused, namely Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, nor through any of the civil parties admitted in this case. The expert will take an oath in the courtroom, and there is no reserved witness today. Thank you, Mr. President. President, thank you. The chamber will now decide on the request by Nuon Chea. The chamber receives a waiver from Nuon Chea to be present in the courtroom dated 9 February 2015, which states that due to his health, that is a headache, backache, and cannot sit for long and cannot concentrate for long, and in order to be effective in participating in the future hearings, he waives his direct presence in the courtroom today, that is 9 February 2015. Nuon Chea has been informed by his counsel about the consequence of this waiver, that it is in no way can be construed as a waiver of his rights to be tried fairly or to challenge evidence presented or admitted to this court at any time during his trial. The chamber also has since the medical report of Nuon Chea made by the duty counsel dated 9 February 2015, who noticed that the health condition of Nuon Chea remains the same, that he cannot sit for long due to backache, and recommends that he shall be allowed to follow the proceedings remotely, that is from a holding cell downstairs. Based on this information and pursuant to Internal Rule 81.5 of the ECCC Internal Rules, the chamber agrees and grants Nuon Chea to follow the proceedings remotely from a holding cell downstairs via audio-visual means for today's proceedings. And as Nuon Chea waives his direct presence in this courtroom, the AV unit is instructed to link the proceedings so that Nuon Chea can follow it from a holding cell downstairs. And that applies for today's proceedings. Court officer, please invite the expert Elizabeth Becker into the courtroom. President, good morning, Madam Expert. What is your name?
Elizabeth Becker.
Thank you. And before we continue, I'd like to advise you a little bit on the use of the microphone. Please wait until you see the red light on the tip of the microphone before you make your response. Otherwise, your voice will not go through the system. And most importantly, you need to go through the system so that your response will be interpreted into the official languages of the court. And so please make a slight pause between question and answer session. And we thank you for that. And Madam, when were you born?
October 28, 1947.
And what is your nationality?
United States of America.
And where is your permanent address?
Washington, D.C.
And what is your occupation?
Journalist and author.
Thank you. And what is your religion?
I'm a Christian.
Thank you. The greffier made an oral report this morning that to your best ability, you are not related by blood or by law to any of the two accused, that is Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, nor through any of the civil party in this case. Is this information correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And Madam Elizabeth Becker, pursuant to Rule 31.2 of the internal rules of the ECCC. As an expert, you have to take an oath before you provide your testimony, or you can make an affirmation based on your religion. Do you agree to that?
Yes.
And the international graduate, Mr. Roger, could you please lead the process of swearing in of this expert?
Ms. Becker, please repeat after me. I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
Thank you. And Ms. Becker, the trial chamber and the parties are grateful to you for making this long journey to assist us in our search for the truth on matters which are crucial for this trial and for Cambodian people. I know that your testimony has been several times postponed, and the trial chamber really appreciates your availability. Ms. Becker, can you tell us what education did you follow, and when did you start your career as a journalist? Was it your occupation during the Democratic Cambodia period?
I am a graduate of the University of Washington in Seattle. My degree is in South Asian Studies. I attended the Kendriya Hindi Sansthan in Agra, India for language training. I went to graduate school at the University of Washington. I came to Cambodia at the end of 1972 and became a journalist, first for the Far Eastern Economic Review and then the Washington Post. I covered the war here until the end of 1974, returned to the United States to Washington, D.C., where I was a correspondent for the Washington Post. Then when I came to Democratic Kampuchea in December 1978, I came continuing as a Washington Post correspondent.
Thank you. And do you know how to read, write, or speak a Khmer language?
I did speak Khmer, but that was years. I was never able to. I was never able to.
Thank you. And can you describe us your experience as a journalist? And can you tell us how many books you have written on Cambodia?
I've been a daily journalist for 40 years, first with the Washington Post correspondent, then with National Public Radio in the United States, where I was the senior foreign editor in charge of all of the foreign correspondents covering the world. Then I went back to newspapering, and my last position was New York Times correspondent. I retired from daily journalism 6 years. I've written one largish book, Cambodia, called When the War Was Over. It has been translated into Khmer and French. And then I wrote a very small little book called Opana that's only available in Phnom Penh, Cambodia.
Thank you. And concerning your book, When the War Was Over, when was it published for the first time? What research have you made? And what methods have you used? And on which sources did you rely on?
The book was first published in 1986 by Simon & Schuster. The sources were multiple. As I said, I was a correspondent here during the war, so I relied quite a bit on primary research. The reporting and work I did during the war, the heaviest beginning in January 1973. Many interviews with the major players and with the common people, and documentation. Then back in Washington, I did more interviews, United Nations. That's when I first met and interviewed political figures from Democratic Kampuchea, primarily Ieng Sary and Nuon Chea. Then I kept up through refugee reports that came through Washington, the FIBIS, which is the government translation service, so that I could know what was being said on the radio of Democratic Kampuchea. And as I said, I would go to the UN every year when the Democratic Kampuchea delegation arrived to hear what they had to say and to request a visa to visit Cambodia. Then, as you know, I traveled there in December 1978 for 2 weeks. After that, I began serious work on my book, augmenting my previous research with more interviews, coming back here to Cambodia to read and to work in all of the archives that became available after the Vietnamese invasion. And as well, I interviewed foreign diplomats involved with their policy towards this country and foreign diplomats who live.
Thank you. Have you used the material provided by other researchers? Can you identify them and indicate the nature of this material, if any?
Well, certainly there was a handful of people who were working on the same subject. So, for instance, Ben Kiernan at Yale, Stephen Heder, the two people who had the most original research at the beginning. Other journalists, we all tended to cooperate and work together because it was such a difficult story. The UN, on the border, I certainly talked to many. Going back to the border to find out what the refugees said, I had a lot of help from the United Nations research. Those are the major. David Hawke, David Chandler. There's a dozen people who shared a lot. We shared what we had.
Thank you. And do you remember the most significant interviews you conducted personally during the period of democratic Cambodia or immediately just after it?
Yes, it was unforgettable. While I was in democratic Kampuchea, I interviewed Ieng Sary and Pol Pot. Immediately afterwards, again, I interviewed Ieng Sary and I interviewed Ieng Thirith at length. Those, I would say, were the most significant.
Thank you. And the Chamber would like to make the following remarks on certain issues. The Chamber has already noted in its decision, that is paragraph 18 of document E-15, that Elizabeth Becker has been principally sought by the parties due to her personal knowledge of facts relevant to the democratic Kampuchea period, either through her presence in Cambodia during this period or through the interviews she conducted with leaders or cadres. Parties are therefore reminded that while Elizabeth Becker has been called as an expert, she may also be questioned on facts within her knowledge relevant to the current case. Parties are also reminded that in order to facilitate the testimony of the expert Elizabeth Becker, the Trial Chamber has informed them that it considers the following topics as the most relevant for case 002/02. The December 1978 trip in democratic Kampuchea of Elizabeth Becker with Richard Dutman and Malcolm Caldwell. The interviews she conducted with Ieng Sary, Ieng Thirith, Pol Pot, Tuan Prasit, other Khmer Rouge cadres, and Cambodian refugees, if any. CPK policies concerning the treatment of specific groups, the relationships between Cambodia Democratic and Vietnam, and the allegations of mass violations of human rights against Democratic Cambodia, and the international context in which these allegations were made. These topics will form the framework of its questioning, and parties are encouraged to focus on them as well. I leave the floor now to the judges of the bench who may want to put questions to this expert if you wish to do so. Judge Lavange, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mrs. Becker. I will put a number of questions to you. I have many questions and we'll go through those questions this morning. I hope we will complete the examination. You have said that you were a correspondent for several newspapers here in Cambodia up to 1974. You also told us that you came to Cambodia in December 1978. You also said that you had contacts with officials of democratic Kampuchea, particularly when these officials went to New York to the United Nations. Can you tell us more specifically who you met, from when, and how often?
Every year at the General Assembly in New York, which is usually in October, I would go to New York and either go to a press conference or a reception to talk to Ieng Sary. Normally, I believe Tuan Prasit and Khieu Chun were with, but the majority of the conversation would be with Ieng Sary. The first time I met him was not long after the Maya Gez incident, when the American ship was captured offshore here in the Gulf of Thailand, and the United States responded with the bombing and the crew was eventually released. So that was the first time, and Ieng Sary at that moment gave the first Cambodian DK, Democratic Kampuchea response, which I then wrote up for the Washington Post. The next year and the year after were generally, he was less forthcoming. The next year, I believe, was a question of what happened to Cambodian intellectuals who returned to Cambodia and were never heard of again. And several families were there asking about their missing relative. The year after, if I remember correctly, was the whole issue of relations with Vietnam. And at one reception, I was in a conversation with both Ieng Sary and Nuon Chea, who was then the Vietnamese Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they were very polite to each other, but Ieng Sary was talking about the issue. And in 1978 was when he invited the United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to visit Cambodia. The Secretary General declined, and then he invited me, Richard Dudman, and Malcolm Caldwell in that place, and thereafter I then went to Democratic. But that's the extent of, that's the only time Democratic Kampuchea officials were in the United States.
Thank you. So to summarize what you said that you met essentially Mr. Ieng Sary in New York and possibly Mr. Chun Prasit, Mr. Ket Chun. Do you remember other members of the delegation of Democratic Kampuchea? Do you remember, for example, someone called Chan Yoran or another Cambodian by the name of Ieng Sokum?
Definitely Chan Yoran, yes, and he was there at least twice, and I'm sorry I forgot it. The second name, I don't remember. The
second name is Mr. Ieng Sokum. Maybe he was not a diplomat, but he was a Cambodian who was living in the United States, and then he returned to Democratic Kampuchea, and his name was found on the list of the S-21 prisoners. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, Hang Sakum. Yes, he was the American whose family I mentioned earlier. Excuse me. That's his wife was there. Remember, I said one of the families, and I remember the wife was at one of the receptions asking after. And I had met him before he went, and I believe I met him in Washington. Through one of the, I think the Quaker groups, one of the pacifist religions groups were supporting a reunification of, trying to get Cambodians back together after. So I had met him, and then later, after he had gone back to Cambodia and there was no communication with, I then met his wife. So yes, you're right. But I didn't associate him with the delegate.
And were you aware of the fact that a certain number of Cambodians living in the United States had returned to Democratic Kampuchea? Were you aware of that? Were you concerned about these people?
Oh, yes. The first sort of red flag that came up was the total lack of communication. And some of the Cambodians who had returned from Paris had talked about it in a press conference, and I remember reading the press releases on that. So when the Cambodians from the United States left and then never came back, no word. There was no question. There was concern. Yes, families were very concerned.
So you told us that Mr. Ieng Sary came very often, every year, to New York, to the United Nations, and you said that the first time was right after the Mayaguez incident. That is to say, in September 1975. This was the 29th General Assembly session of the. And back then, people were still speaking about the GRUNC, the Royal Government of National Union of Cambodia, and do you know in which circumstances the members of the GRUNC were called to represent Cambodia at the United Nations? How was that transition made from the Lon Nol members to GRUNC members and then to members of Democratic Kampuchea? Do you know how things were organized and when that transition was made?
I'm afraid not. The last year of the Khmer Republic, then Prince Sihanouk tried to convince the UN to vote to seat GRUNC rather than Khmer Republic. That failed, and the only members of the delegation who next were seated as Democratic Kampuchea who I had any interaction with was the new foreign minister, Ieng Sary, and I'm afraid I do not remember if or who represented GRUM.
So we have just spoken about the role of King Sihanouk. Did you have the opportunity of meeting him during that period, in particular in October 1975?
No, he was not at the UN, and I did not meet him until January 1979, when he came back. The next time I saw him was at the UN, January 1970.
Hello.
So I personally drew up a list of Ieng Sary's visits to the UN, and I also noted that Prince Norodom Sihanouk traveled to New York on 6 October 1975, and we know that he also spoke with Kurt Waldheim back then. So the first time that Ieng Sary traveled to New York was on 5 September 1975. He traveled again to New York the following year, 5 October 1976. On 11 October 1977, Ieng Sary is going to make a speech again before the UN General Assembly. And you wrote, by the way, an article which appeared in the Washington Post on 22 October 1977, and it's called Wait Until the Movie. So this was in reference to the broadcasting of propaganda films. Each time that Ieng Sary traveled to New York, apparently there were came with a bit of propaganda material to explain the situation. So I'm also going to read out an excerpt from this document in which you state, or in any case you say that, or Ieng Sary is expected to say that the poor image of democratic Kampuchea is linked to poor information. And Ieng Sary, in his address before the UN, explains that in reality, democratic Kampuchea is moving ahead swiftly under the clairvoyant leadership of the CPK. Its extraordinary successes also involve the water issues, which will be a very important matter for democratic Kampuchea. And he provides figures. He speaks about the building of reservoirs that can contain in total 2 billion cubic meters of water. He also speaks about building hundreds of kilometers of canals allowing to irrigate 250,000 hectares of rice paddies. He speaks about the building of 8 dams, allowing for the irrigation of 130,000 hectares. He also says that the illiteracy rate has been brought down to only 10%. And he specifies that the country is training revolutionary doctors who have a deep love for the people and a high spirit of abnegation. And he also says, out of 100 families, there is 1 hospital, 3 practitioners, a medicine factory, and 3 pharmacists. And he also says that malaria has been practically eradicated. The average annual ratio is 312 kilos of rice per person, and that the production was in excess, and it allowed Cambodian to export several thousands of tons of rice, and that democratic Kampuchea is a country which no longer has any crime, prostitution, and banditry. Do you remember this kind of address? Do you remember this kind of information that Ieng Sary provided?
Yes, and I think I pretty much wrote down exactly what he said. And in that context, then that was what he would later say I would see when I went to the country.
So, in order for us to take note of this document for the hearing, so document is E3/1596. That's the index of the document. The French ERN is 0061 77 92 299, and the Khmer ERN 0029 10 25 228. In English 3000 798 10 to 16. So now I would like you to tell me if you remember if the total tone of the speeches changed in 1978, the character. You said earlier on that the problems with Vietnam had become a bit more prominent. Is that the case? Did the tone of his speeches change?
I can't say that I remember the speech exactly, but the conversation had changed. And I believe it's reflected in the article I wrote. Can't remember the exact words, but I believe the article even had a photograph of Mr. Ieng Sary and Mr. Nuon Chea talking to each other. The problem had elevated to the point where it was now part of the Sino-Soviet split. It was a concern of imminent warfare, and many delegations were concerned about it, not just Democratic Kampuchea and Vietnam.
And at that very same period, there were a certain number of complaints regarding massive violations of human rights, complaints that were filed before the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I did not go to Geneva, but the United States submitted one of the largest files, and it was testimony collected along the border with Thailand. I remember the author was Charles Twining, an American diplomat. The United States was not the only country that filed it, but it was a parallel concern that the question of human rights, with more and more evidence to back up the accusation, was rising in Geneva as the threat of war was building between Vietnam and Cambodia, and it was one of those perfect storms.
So it's in 1978 when you were invited to visit Democratic Kampuchea. So why do you think you were invited with Mr. Dudman and Mr. Caldwell?
The delegation would have preferred UN General Secretary, the Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, when he refused, and he said he refused on the advice of the Soviet Union. Then after that, we were invited. And I just received a cable like that at the news. After talking to them, my presumption was suddenly they wanted foreign witnesses and not just friendly delegations. You can extrapolate that, as I did, that perhaps it was as witnesses and perhaps it was to postpone an imminent invasion. Before I left for Phnom Penh, I visited American officials and foreign officials in Washington with expertise, and they were baffled. They were unsure if a war would happen. Generally, they thought that if the Vietnamese did fight back, that they wouldn't go past the eastern bank of the Mekong. I remember one official said, "This will be a piece of cake. They'll treat you very well. Enjoy yourself." It was mixed signals, very mixed signals.
And back then, you already knew that you were going to travel with Mr. Dudman and Caldwell, or when did you know that they would accompany you on this trip?
I learned about Mr. Dudman when he came to the Washington Post and tried to talk my newspaper into using his articles instead of mine. And we learned about Mr. Caldwell when we all met in Beijing. The only way you could get into Cambodia at that time was through Beijing. There was no other way. So we all met there and flew down together. I believe that's the case. I do not remember knowing about Mr. Caldwell until I got to Beijing.
Did you know that before you, there had been a certain number of foreign delegations, governmental or non-governmental, that had visited Democratic Kampuchea? And what can you tell us about that?
Yes, I certainly knew, and I read all of their reports. The broadcasting service that I mentioned earlier, FIBIS, was very good at translating them. The Democratic Kampuchea radio always broadcast, and I followed it, so that by the time I went, I knew which cooperatives they always brought the delegations to, what the sort of standard scenario would be. It was part of my travel preparations was to go over those friendly delegation meetings. Who would see Pol Pot, who would see Ieng Sary. There was once you study them, there's a certain logic to what they did. And the only delegation that included sort of journalists like us was from Yugoslavia. And that was the most eye-opening of all the reports.
So, indeed, on the case file, we have reports of numerous visits, and I'm going to mention only a few. In particular, there's a visit that apparently was very important, which was the visit of a Chinese leader, Cheng Yung-wei, or known as Cheng Yung-yi, who was the leader who created the production brigades in Dadzai commune. And this visit occurred in December 1977, a little while after Pol Pot's visit to China. And there is also a report of a visit of Japanese delegations, French delegations, Belgian, Danish, and you also spoke about the visit that was conducted in March 1978 by a delegation of Yugoslav journalists. Can you kind of tell us a bit more about this? You said that this is a visit that was an eye-opener. Why?
Because the others were friendly delegations in the sense that they came back with reports that were not critical at all. They came back with reports that more or less mimicked, reflected what they were told, without asking questions that would have been considered impolitic or whatever. The Yugoslavs, they brought real journalists with them, and the film and the photographs, as well as the report, was the first one where you could see, for instance, child labor in the factories. They had a critical eye, so you could hear between the lines what was going on. And I just remember saying, aha, this is starting to make more sense. But I think you have a couple of the articles in your case, do you not?
What we have on the case file are not necessarily articles. They are telegrams, in fact. And these telegrams are quite interesting. There are two of them in particular, documents E3/1112 and E3/1113. And the ERNs are the following. First, Khmer ERN 00020 960 to 962. French ERN 0081 0029 to 31, and English 0043 48 61 to 63. And with regard to the second telegram, this in Khmer is ERN 3 times 0 20 965 to 967, French 0062 30 09 to 12, and English 0043 48 64 to 66. So what's interesting is the fact that these telegrams are addressed to a certain number of recipients, in particular men. Uncle corrects interpreter. Nuon Chea, Bongkovan, Bongvon, to the office and to the records. So, of course, the parties may discuss the meaning of these titles. Apparently refers to Pol Pot. Nuon refers to Nuon Chea. Van refers to Ieng Sary. Von to Von Vet. And the office is Office 870. And the person signing this telegram is a certain Kang, whose name will appear again in another document. So what's interesting to note here is that the person who wrote this telegram obviously accompanied the delegation during its trip, and he provides the detail of the questions that were asked by the journalists, and he explains that when certain questions were not answered, and he states that the conversation, when he avoided the questions deliberately, and he also mentions Cambodia's refusal to negotiate with Vietnam, and also he mentions quantities of rice that were exported. And he also provides comments on the way that the journalists react, as well as the members of the delegation, and he also says that the journalists would like the CPK to fall within a revisionist line by focusing on material priorities. So you discovered these documents that were given to you to prepare for your testimony. Do you have any comments, therefore, to make with relation to these documents?
Well, that was the first time I'd seen them, and it reminded me a bit of some of the documents that were written after my trip as well. When I said the trip was eye-opening to me at the time, I believe one of the things that most brought this home was the film, the footage they took, and that's the first time I had seen real footage from a delegation, and it was shown on American television on CBS, and I talked to the people who put it together, and that was, more than anything, it was the photographs and the film that made such a strong impression.
President Council Coupe, you can have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Very small comment, no objection at all, but just when you were reading the telegram, I observed, at least in my English translation, Nuon, brother van and brother vorn. Very small thing, but as you know, the words brother and are relative. So I don't know how that is in French. In the English translation, it reads brother van and vorn and brother van.
That's exactly what I said. I read Uncle Nuon and Brother Van. That is what I read. So other delegations kept on coming to visit Democratic Kampuchea, in particular delegations from the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Australia, as well as a delegation from the Communist-Leninist Marxist Party of the United States. This delegation was led by a certain Dan Bernstein. Did you meet Daniel Bernstein? Have you ever heard of Daniel Bernstein? And what can you tell us about him?
I didn't meet him until in the 80s, I believe. By then, he had stopped being a Marxist-Leninist, and he was writing financial journalism. What I knew about him was, and the party was very small, and it was part, as you pointed out, it was a sign to those of us watching that Democratic Kampuchea was opening up. To have an American delegation, even a friendly one, was considered an opening up of the country.
Particularly an American delegation, a friendly American delegation, because Mr. Dan Bernstein at the time wrote a lot of articles for a newspaper, an American newspaper. He also wrote reports on his visits, his trips. And in one of the sentences he wrote, he said, "Not a single person who really visited Kampuchea comes back telling stories of forced labor, famine, genocide, independently of their political perspectives. All visitors to democratic Kampuchea have been very impressed by the enthusiasm, the determination, and the spirit of hard work of the Kampuchea people, a country that has been devastated by war." We are talking of document E3/707, and the ERN in French is as follows: S00742556. We have a book written by someone. There was a curtain communication, Mr. President. That book is titled Living Hell, Democratic Kampuchea. That document is E3/2415. Mr. President, there are cuts in the source speech from Judge Lavergne. The interpreters cannot hear what he is saying.
Could you repeat the question?
What I was saying was that what was perhaps remarkable in all the reports I have referred to is the fact that some sites are always visited during those trips. And among those sites, we have certain sites that were also part of your tour within Democratic Kampuchea. Did you notice that? And can you tell us what sites appear to be most appropriate for visits by international delegations?
Yes, in fact, in my book, I point out every single visit that I knew another one had visited. And those sites usually, the people who are presented as common peasants are usually top cadre, and it's all set up in a, Potemkin village kind of thing. And I wrote in my book, and I, off the top of my head, no, unless you wanted me to look at the book, Preah Mias, I think, was one of them. And if you notice that the Dan Burstein, the propaganda is not all that different from a lot of the other delegations. There was a Swedish gentleman. I mean, they're very repetitive. They come back with the same stories, the same things, and of course, it's in complete opposite of what the refugees say. So it's standard issue, and I believe Mr. Anyway,
I would like to revisit the issue of the context of your invitation in December 1978. Do you also recall whether during that period the Vietnamese had also invited foreign journalists to visit the front line to see what was happening?
If I remember correctly, and that's not something I prepared for, I believe this is the same time that Nuon Chea, Tiziano Terzani, isn't that more or less the same time? I know there were, I'm not sure if this is before or after our trip, but it was similar. It's the same time. And maybe Parango was there, Le Monde. Yeah, I think those.
So indeed, it would appear that both sides wanted to communicate with people. Perhaps they will also have a willingness to open up. You said the UN Secretary General, Mr. Kurt Waldheim, had been invited. I also note that you made mention of a policy to open up for touristic purposes. That was also on the agenda. Some Thai tourism agencies were invited to visit Angkor for short periods of time. There were projects of that nature. Do you recall such projects?
All I remember is talk of the projects. I did not see any tourists.
Still regarding the context of your visits, that is a context from the American point of view. It would appear that the consequences of the Vietnam War were extremely important for the American public opinion, and there were perhaps too many manifestations of interest regarding what was happening in Southeast Asia at the time. Can you tell us how American public opinion reacted to any information that was transpiring from democratic Cambodia at the time?
Before the invasion?
Yes, that is prior to your visit, at the time when you visited Cambodia, democratic Cambodia.
Well, in context, the Vietnam War was the first American defeat, so it was not a topic of conversation. In the United States, public opinion was largely concerned about the refugees from Vietnam and to a less extent Cambodia. There was the beginning of an understanding that something strange was going on in Cambodia, but the Cambodians who were resettled were having the usual struggles of refugees, immigrants establishing their base, whereas the Vietnamese community, larger, stronger. So Cambodia wasn't much on the radar except for official Washington. And official Washington, you had the administration of President Jimmy Carter was concerned about, obviously, the Sino-Soviet split, moving towards the Chinese side. Just, if you remember, just before the invasion, Vietnam signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. At that time, both the Vietnamese and Democratic Kampuchea were visiting the different capitals of ASEAN, trying to get them on their side. So there was a who's going to be with whom atmosphere. And the United States was definitely leaning towards China. But then the problem was Democratic Kampuchea was the Chinese ally, and the United States simultaneously was creating this incredible dossier about human rights violations in Democratic Kampuchea. So it was the policymakers were at wit's end. And an example that's just the State Department had their separate desks for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and the nickname was Very Lost Causes. That's how much it was a confusion for the United States.
Now we have on record a document with the reference number E3/2370. That is a report which had been prepared at the request of the Subcommission for Asia and the Pacific for the International Relations Commission of the United States Congress. That document is dated 4th of October 1978. That is shortly before your visit, and at a time when, as you said, it wasn't clear how the situation was going to unfold, particularly the conflict between Vietnam and Cambodia. But it appears that the U.S. government had felt that there was a serious and important conflict between these two countries. Were you aware of that report? That report which was established for the Congress?
Yes, and I knew the committee members, and they knew it was a very, very serious issue, yes.
Perhaps what we gather from that report is point number 9 of the findings, wherein it is stated the reaction of other nations to the war has taken the form of universal repugnance to get involved in it. They all call for a negotiated solution from both of them, but none of them seems to lead the mediation out of fear of getting bogged down in the war. Such reluctance or repugnance would increase should the conflict persist. So this repugnance to get involved in Cambodian affairs, is that something that you also felt?
Yes, I cannot exaggerate the feeling in the United States after the defeat in Vietnam. No one wanted to get involved in Vietnam or Cambodia. Now, Cambodia itself, if you remember at this time, Senator McGovern, I believe, went on the floor of the Senate to suggest sending in troops, perhaps, suggesting some sort of intervention in Cambodia to stop the human rights violations. And he was ridiculed because he was the man who wanted the U.S. out of Vietnam. And then he said he knew he would be ridiculed, but he wanted to say the human rights violations, or the stories of them are so serious there might be a need for intervention. So yes, it was a very serious argument. At that stage, I also that's what I remember. Yes.
President, the time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a break now and resume at 10:30. And court officer, please assist the expert during the break and have her return to the courtroom at 10:30. The court is now in recess.